So, hello everyone, and welcome to our first seminar for Law 8712, Comparative Constitutional Law. And we're recording live in Toowoomba via Zoom and TechSmith. And today I'm just going to take you through some parts of this course with particular emphasis on your assessments. So, to start with, here are my contact details. So my name is Benjamin Gusson. I've been here since July 2014. My main area of research is really something called constitutional law and economics. So it's basically interdisciplinary work between constitutional law and constitutional economics. But since I've arrived here, mainly my teaching was in relation to business law, which is actually the largest course that we have in the school. And then I have my electives of ECO 3033, which is offered in even years, and this course, which is comparative constitutional law, offered in odd years. That's my email right there. My office is in Toowoomba in Q427A in the Q block, also known as the Phoenix building. If you want to come and see me, you're most welcome to do so. Just make sure that you make an appointment, and then we'll find the best time and place to meet. I'm usually happy to meet over Zoom or via Skype, or just phone me, especially if there's an urgent matter on this phone number, 4631-2435. As you know, there will be a semester break between the 22nd of December and the 1st of January. Actually, I will not be contactable from the 22nd until the 2nd of January, so you can contact me from the 3rd. But again, if there's something urgent, especially in relation to assessments, then let me know. There is no textbook for this course. I've assigned a handbook. Of course, this is a research course, which means that I expect you to do your own research rather than simply read parts of a textbook. But that's exactly what we're going to do today, at least to kick things off, in particular in relation to the first assessment. But what you have is a handbook, the Oxford Handbook of Comparative Constitutional Law. I suppose the most important thing to say about this handbook is that you would read it as a handbook in terms of looking at certain parts or looking at certain content that relates to what you want to do, rather than reading it as sort of a textbook that you go through it from cover to cover. So that's not the expectation. The expectation is that you would selectively go in and see what's relevant to what you are working on, and then use that if it's for your assessments or anything else that you are working on, even outside the particular assessments in this course. Now, my teaching methodology or method is called heutagogy, which means self-directed learning, in terms of not requiring you actually to follow me. So I'm not the source or the well of wisdom that you are looking up to and trying to just sort of copy. That's not how what's going to happen here. This is self-directed or self-organization, so it's like complexity theory. So I usually give you the access to all of your assessments from the very beginning. And as adults, really, with your own sort of life experiences, you would be able to finish off whatever you need to do as early as you want. So the key point is that you can finish this course, this year, simply by finishing your assessments and submitting those assessments, and you're done. It's not about waiting on me to do something for you. If you have something that you need to be done, you need to contact me and ask questions. Okay? It's not a matter of just waiting for something to happen. There's nothing that's going to happen. It's all in your hands. Now, I want to take just a few, maybe half an hour or so, to just talk about the assessments, because usually that's the most important thing, and that's the first focus for all students. So, Of course, there's no final exam, and all you have is 2 pieces of assessment weighted equally, so 50 marks on the first and then 50 marks on the second. The first is what's known as a directed research problem. So as you'll see on the study desk, we'll go there soon, you find that it is just a number of questions, related questions, and you are expected to do certain things if you are doing this course as part of your LLB, or if it's part of your JD, then you'll have to top it up with something else that's also explained on the study desk. We'll go there and we'll look at it soon. And the same thing with the research paper. So one of them is due on the 18th of December, and the other one is due next year on the 9th of February. So as I said, that these are just indicative due dates. You don't have to wait until the due date to submit. You can submit at any time. Okay? Everything is already open, and everything is already on the study desk. So let's have a look on the study desk to see what we actually have done there. So under the assessments tab, you'll find the assessment details, and it talks about the first assessment, as we said, and it says a directed research problem, and you have 3,500 words if you are an LLB student. As usual, this is plus or minus 10%, the plus usually, and 5,000 words for the JD students. Same thing for the research paper. Now, some students find it useful to explain to them what will actually gain you money or grades under this assessment. So basically, you need to hit these learning objectives. Another, of course, source to look at would be your marking rubric, but that's what we are looking for. So if you actually show and demonstrate a high level of achievement on these learning objectives, then you are on your way towards a high distinction or an A. So, and just one thing about high distinction, because sometimes students come to this course with the expectation that, you know, it's a research course, so most people are going to get HDs and A's. That's not the case. So HDs are exactly that, high distinction. So usually 1%. So I think there are 6 or 7 students in this course. So maybe only 1 will get the HD. And it will always be relative. In evolutionary economics, they call it spiteful, because what's important is that you show that you are better than the cohort, not just simply better than an ideal. Okay? So you will be tested against an ideal, which is your marking rubric basically. But if you want to get an HD, you need to demonstrate that you have gone further and have done more and have shown a higher level of intelligence basically compared to your cohort. At least we set the expectations so no one is surprised at the end. But of course, it's very easy to pass the course, so if that's what you're after, that shouldn't be a worry. If you, of course, submit your assessments. So, what are these learning objectives? The first one says use comparative constitutional study, or rather use comparative constitutional study to offer insights into constitutional choices in Australia. Okay. So for the purposes of our first assessment, that's going to be basically in relation to this interaction or interplay between subsidiarity and federalism. Okay? The second one is about explaining how different constitutional systems deal with similar issues. So we'll be looking at other jurisdictions and trying to figure out how they compare, and compare between quotation marks to Australia, because we really need to go back and look at something I suppose some of you have done previously, maybe in Law 8001, which is legal methodology, with Dr. Jeremy Patrick. So there, I suppose you've been introduced to, at least introduced to this methodology of comparative analysis. You know, there were other so the main one usually is what we call doctrinal, which is really common law analysis. And then there are things like law and economics and so on. Excuse me. I've put actually the reading that you've been assigned in Law 8001 on the study desk, just to make sure that you can use that as the starting point to continue from what you've done in that legal methodology course. All right. The third learning objective is to evaluate federalism and subsidiarity in different constitutional contexts. So this is really the main focus of our basically two assessments, really, because this is a matter that has been coming sort of to the forefront in recent years. We're talking back from the Abbott government and the CEDA report, which is the Committee for Economic Development of Australia, on federalism in Australia and the problems that it faces and the propositions that could be sort of forwarded to improve on that. Of course, after Turnbull came into office and until today, that thing really went back to the sort of back burner, but it is still something that comes back in terms of propositions like decentralization and emphasis on how we can restructure this relationship between state and federal governments so that it could actually become more efficient or basically to optimize that relationship. The last objective is appraise the role of and differences between subnational constitutions. So this is most is going to be really the learning objective for the last research paper. It will touch, of course, you will have to touch upon it when you do your federal or subsidiarity assessment of different jurisdictions, because that's how you'll be able to sort of distinguish between whether we are talking about subsidiarity or federalism. All right, let's look at then, excuse me, let's look at then the first assessment. So the research questions are on this topic, federalism and subsidiarity. And you see 5 questions there. It says in answering question 4, you will need to make comparisons between Australia and Canada. So that's if you are an LLB student. That's the 3,500 word opinion. And it says there in red, additional component for JD students. It says for question 4, you also need to compare Australia with the US. So if you are doing this as an LLB student, you only need to look at Australia and Canada. If you are doing this as a JD student, you will have to write the 5,000 opinion, where that extra 1,500 words is going to go to a further comparison between Australia and the US. So you need to do a 3-way comparison. Okay. So you have the marks there for each one of these questions. They add up to 50. The first one says, explain your understanding of subsidiarity. The second says, explain your understanding of federalism. Okay. And these are probably the easiest questions. Then it says, what's the relationship between federalism and subsidiarity? So now that you have explained your understanding of both, how do they interact with each other? How do they influence each other? Then we come to the really substantive part of this assignment. It says, is subsidiarity a constitutional principle in Australia and in Canada? So both JD and LLB students will do this, but of course the JD will add as well in the US. Is subsidiarity a constitutional principle in Australia? Okay. So now that we have explained what we understand of subsidiarity, what we understand by subsidiarity and federalism, then we need to look at the interaction between the two, and now we need to apply them, to apply that understanding into 2 or 3 jurisdictions. Okay. The last question says, should Australia continue to be a federal polity? Why and why not? Now this is question number 5, okay, from previous offerings of this course, just to make sure. This is a question that relates to the first 4. It's not a separate question. It's question number 5. So once you have done all of that, we come now and reflect on should Australia continue to be a federal polity. So the answer I'm looking for is not yes or no. Yeah. What I'm looking for is why. Okay, why or why not? And the answer might not actually be yes, it should be or it shouldn't be. So there might be a huge gray area in between where we can find actually points that we can raise in relation to subsidiarity. Okay, so keep in mind that this is really sort of a something that has to do with the interaction between federalism and subsidiarity. So what I'm trying to do here, because this assignment really is trying to bring to your attention this idea of subsidiarity. Okay, and how subsidiarity is similar or different from federalism. Okay, and then how that subsidiarity could inform our understanding of federalism, whether it's in Australia or in other jurisdictions. So we're talking here about the 3 great Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-American federations. But you will find that there are loud voices today in Australia that keep talking about the usefulness or otherwise of the federal model for a country like Australia. Let's just delve a little bit into this a bit more. I have only one student in the auditorium here in the classroom, so I'll have to pick on him. His name is Chris. Yeah. So let's just maybe play a little bit with this idea of federalism and how it works with the possibility of, you know, trying to flesh out some of the stuff that we need to do for the assignment. So it's a good thing. Maybe we can use this discussion as well as sort of a starting point for what we need to do for the assignment. And I'm trying to figure out where they have the microphone, the audience mic, but I think I will just... Can you now hear me or no?
Yeah, okay. I mean I can hear you fine.
But I don't think that I can pick you up on this mic. So I'll have to come closer to you probably, and then I'll have to repeat what you say just to make sure that it shows up as well in the recording. So the idea is we talk about federalism, and I'm getting some feedback. Okay, so let's try this one more time. Probably because there's a that's the mic. Okay, the mic's here on the ceiling, so I think you will be picked up as well from the mic in the ceiling as well. So I don't have to come close to you. That's why we got this feedback. So let's try this one more time. Okay, we say that some people, like at Griffith, for example, they talk about federalism. There was just recently a sort of a national conference, not recently, last year, in Griffith about a people's federation. Okay, it's a series that they have every year, and they talked about, you know, whether there's a need for federalism in Australia, or should we maybe just get rid of the states. Okay, that seemed to be a very popular model in the conference. Get rid of the states and just let's have something like China or Russia. And of course, when I make these analogies, probably you say, oh, he doesn't like that idea. I don't. But let's understand why it's a good thing or a bad thing. What do you think, Chris? Do you think that Australia, how do you evaluate now, this country is now almost 200 plus years old, and it has always had this federal system. How do you evaluate this federal system? What do you think as an Australian citizen? You are an Australian citizen, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that theoretically, the abolition of states might be attractive, but I think politically it never pass muster in Australia because there is, at a social level, too strong affiliation with the states. They've been around for 100 years as a federated state, and before that, most of them for up to 70 years as colonies. I think it's too ingrained in who we are as Australia to identify with states. So the initial premise, I think when we talk about federalism, I think it's probably here to stay.
Okay, so you're saying that the states are so ingrained in our psyche that it's just difficult to see how we can be Australians without having the states.
I agree.
But at the same time, we are also so attached to our federal government, to Canberra, that we won't actually be still able to get rid of Canberra, right? We can't become something like New Zealand. It will always be that these 9 jurisdictions plus the territories are always going to be in Australia. And you're saying this is because of difficulties with changing the status quo. It's definitely because of how the Constitution has been written and the difficulties with amending the Constitution.
Well, I think that's an additional layer, and it's not just amending the federal constitution. As you may not be aware, you have to amend in Queensland, you'd have to amend quite substantially the Queensland constitution, and to a lesser degree all the other state constitutions as well.
All right. So great. So this is our political argument, right? And why is it political? Why do I call it political? Because it's really not based on the legal principles or the normative signals you would get from legal analysis. So what we're talking about here is pragmatic, okay? You have difficulties with these changes. It's going to cost too much. You can't do it. Okay, let's now assume that all of that is resolved. You can actually do whatever you want. You are the czar of the universe. There's no transaction costs related to changing any of the constitutions. Okay? So we can do whatever we think is best for Australia. So best, of course, is yet to be defined. But if we go down that path, okay, let's assume that all these political hurdles are overcome, and now we can do whatever we want in Australia. Okay? What then would be the best option? Is it going to be still a federal system? Okay? Let's just imagine that we are actually sitting in those constitutional conferences back in the 1890s, and that we are the majority and we are able to influence the outcome of the draft, or basically what we need to have in terms of our federal our constitutional design, or the architecture of our constitution. Now, how do you see the attractiveness of the federal model with hindsight? So now we have 200 years of this model. Taking that on board, do you think it was a successful model? Is it a successful model or not?
I do. I think it was successful. I think that some level of subnational federal or subnational competitiveness is required in Australia. I don't think you need states with such strong plenary jurisdictional plenary power in their parliaments, for example. I think that's a bit of an oddity of the Australian system that probably doesn't reflect the fact that most Australians would like to see, I think, the federal government to have sufficient and stated primacy.
Okay.
Whereas, the constitutional reality is it's probably the opposite in Australia. With our state governments and state legislatures that have got plenary jurisdiction. And I don't think that really reflects the understanding modern Australians have about Australia first, state second. So I guess going back to the question, I think that some level of subnational competitiveness is still required in Australia because the actual geographic landscape is so large. The industrial spread is so diverse that I think there always has to be some element of local control with governments with sufficient meaty powers, but probably not as staunchly dependent as our states currently are.
Okay. So Chris still says, even if we have control over what happens in Australia in terms of politics, we would still go down the exact same path we have been down through in terms of federalism. It is still the best model for Australia, and it's still the best model, at least partly because of the colossal size of this continent. The idea that we have very large tracts of land, so we need to actually have 2 layers of government, well, 3 layers, plus of course the local government.
I think that there needs to be an expression of the people's want and desire to have local decision making.
Okay. So you add as well that there's still, however, need or room for improvement in driving down or pushing down or devolving the decision making to the local level. So people are still happy with this federal system, but if there's something we can do for the future, we need more and more devolution towards the local level. Okay. Let's leave that there for now. We'll come back and flesh that out soon. Let me just keep going with the assessments for now. So at least that's maybe something for you to start with, thinking about the assessment and what's the expectation there. Then you have your marker rubric. So I think that's self-explanatory. You can see what's required for an HD, for example, and you have these different dimensions there. It says, please note, the first three of the criteria above will be equally weighted in the assessment of each of your short answers. Okay? And says, the last of the criteria will be weighted to only 1 to 2 marks of the total marks for each question. You will receive comments on strengths and weaknesses for each of your short answers. Okay? I think that's self-explanatory. We can leave that there. Let's then look at the second assessment quickly. So I think that's self-explanatory. That's where the rubric is. You can see where you can hand in the assignment online. So don't email it to me, please. Hand it in that way. And then the assignment, the second assignment, which is due on the 9th of February, which doesn't mean, of course, that you have to leave it till then. You can submit any time depending on your workloads or whatever else you're working on. Okay. So this is, again, your research paper. Okay. This is about writing a longer research paper. Okay. So 3,500 for LLBs and 5,000 for JDs. And the question, again, relates, or the paper relates to all 4 learning objectives we've looked at earlier. So our topic is subnational constitutionalism. Okay. So 2 things here. You're talking about subnational. So these are the constitutions that are not like our federal constitution. These are at the state level, or if you're in Canada, there would be the provinces, for example, or the cantons in Switzerland. But note what we're talking about here is subnational constitutionalism. What do we understand by the word constitutionalism? What do we mean when we say constitutionalism? You want to help out, Chris? So in previous, maybe from your constitutional law, when we talked about constitutionalism, what's that philosophy? What's that idea? It relates somehow to the rule of law. But so basically it says that you have constitutions, and these constitutions are going to function as limits on what the government can do in terms of its powers. So it's about limiting the power of government or the state through these instruments that we refer to as constitutions. And now we're talking about that idea of constitutionalism in terms of subnational structures. So if it's Queensland, for example, we're talking about how the Queensland Constitution limits the powers of the Queensland government, okay, but also probably, okay, looking at how the limits of federal government powers could also be enshrined in subnational constitutions. So just recently, one of the sort of most important, I think, events of recent times, and it has been brewing for quite a while, was the events of independence in Catalonia. Okay. So as you know, in that Spanish region, they decided to have a referendum as to whether they want to secede from the Kingdom of Spain. And that was possible, really, because of this idea of subnational constitutionalism. So in a way, that idea could be for the good of the federal system. So you can devolve some of the functions to states because of efficiency arguments. But it also could end up causing a disturbance or a fracture in the existing federal system, usually over time. We saw something also similar in the Kurdish question. So as you know, Iraq is a federal government, which is a very surprising thing actually in that region. So I originally come from the northern part of Israel, from a place called Shechem. So we're Samaritans. And in the whole of the Arab world, we're not Arabs ourselves, but that's one of the minorities that lives in northern Israel. But in the whole of the Arab world, you will not find one single federal government. Not even Lebanon. Lebanon is a small country situated north of Israel, and it has a consortiational sort of approach to its constitutional arrangements, in the sense that they have a lot of different ethnicities and a lot of different religions in that small country. So they decided, with the help of the French, who designed their legal systems, to actually distribute the institutions of governance based on the size of these minorities within Lebanon. So you'll find the president has to be Christian, a Maronite, so they are pretty much like Catholics. Okay, and then you will have one president who's the prime minister, who has to be, I think, a Sunni Muslim, and then you would have another president, I think the president of the parliament maybe, and they have to be, I think, a Shia Muslim. So that's the constitution that they have there. They don't have a federal system, right? So Iraq was transformed into a federal system because of the American invasion. They helped them to transfer themselves into a federal polity for the first time probably in the Arab world. One exception that comes to mind actually, I have to say, is that of the United Arab Emirates. Okay, that's where you have Dubai and you have Abu Dhabi and so on. And that came out again with the help of the British in the 1970s. And what they did there was to have these very small emirates unite into this, what you could refer to as a federal system. So we go back to Iraq. So when the federal system was designed and implemented, they came up with one region for the Kurds. Now Kurdistan is a very specific problem. I might be digressing a little bit, but that's really the context of what you want to talk about in this assessment. Kurdistan, the Kurdish people are a diaspora really in 3 different countries. They are not Arabs. Okay, they have their own language, but they are Sunni Muslims, the majority. Okay. Okay. So there are diaspora in 3 different countries: in Turkey, and in Iran, and in Iraq, and there's also a minority in Syria. So we can talk about really 4 different parts of Kurdistan: northern Kurdistan in Turkey, eastern Kurdistan in Iran, western Kurdistan in Syria, and southern Kurdistan in Iraq. And what happened, of course, is that they created this region as a federal part of the Iraqi government, and over time they did something very similar to Catalonia. They said, look, this is not working for us. What is not working for them? This idea of having to share the revenues of oil from the region. Okay, well, it's disputed areas, of course, between them and the federal government, but they said, this revenue is ours. We don't want to share it, or at least we think that the way we're being us to share it with the central government is problematic for us. So we want to go our own way. We want to become our own independent government, independent country. So what they did was to have another referendum similar to what they did in Catalonia, both of which happened actually just earlier this year. And both came back with strong popular sentiments in terms of wanting to become separate. Okay. One of them in Catalonia, of course, has doubts in relation to its validity because of, again, constitutional issues. Same thing in Kurdistan. But the point is, they both came back and said, we want to be separate. And in both cases, the central government basically shut down the independence that was given earlier to these regions, to the point of including, for example, shutting the airports in places like Kurdistan and taking control over oil fields and so on. Okay, so there is your national constitutionalism for you in action. In fact, I can bring this very much so closer to home when we talk about something called the Wexit. Have you heard of the Wexit, Chris? So even in Australia, we've heard, of course, they will never be taken seriously, but my point is to show you that any federal system, and that then takes us to the next question, and whether a federal system is in fact an equilibrium system. Can you generate a long-term equilibrium if you have your polity, your constitutional design, based on this idea of federalism? Of course, Wexit comes from Brexit. Brexit basically was about the British wanting to leave the European Union. We picked up on it here in Western Australia, and they started talking about something similar. We want to leave the Commonwealth. Why would you want to do that? Well, again, the same story we heard in Catalonia, the same story we heard in Kurdistan, and it's always about sharing the revenues, basically, from whatever resources that revenue is coming from, and sharing them with the central government, and issues in relation how much money should go to the federal government and how much money should stay in the states. So let's look at these quotes to start us off on the research question. It says, Australian comparative constitutional law expert Charles Saunders noted in 2000, long time ago now, that a revival of interest in state constitutions in Australia would be consistent with developments elsewhere in the world. True. And we just talked about two of those developments, Kurdistan and Catalonia. Are we still talking about the same thing? So she's saying basically interest in these constitutions. What does she mean by that? Simply from an academic point of view, or interest in terms of their power? Excuse me, vis-a-vis the Commonwealth Constitution. In other words, can they stand up to the Commonwealth Constitution and say, nope, this is our jurisdiction? Now there's also Robert Williams. Okay. Now Robert Williams has retired already. This is from the US, from Pennsylvania. And his paper basically is about teaching and researching subnational constitutional law. Now this is an area that you will not find many people interested in. Okay. Partly because maybe it doesn't have the same prestige of working, and because really constitutional law, if you didn't know, is sort of the Rolls Royce, or the Maserati of legal discourse or legal scholarship, simply because it's the capstone. So if something happens with the Constitution or its interpretation, it will have a ripple effect that will catch each and every other corner of the legal system. But if you talk about subnational constitutions, they are not seen as important, at least, as the scholarship that comes on the national level. But the other problem with subnational constitutionalism is that it almost inevitably, at least in my opinion, leads to this cursed word of succession, of secession rather. So the idea is that once we start talking about constitutionalism in terms of subnational polities, okay, that in a way, is really a snowball effect towards someone seceding from one of the federal polities where they are in. We've seen it as well in Catalonia. Okay. What did Robert say? So he said, we contend that a careful study of the subnational constitutions of component units, so like states, must proceed first from a top-down or center-periphery, so non-subsidiarity view to determine the quality and quality of subnational constitutional space permitted by national constitutions to the competent units. There's a missing S there. This would involve a determination of legal or de jure questions concerning the competency of component units to enact their own constitutions. Enact their own constitutions. So we've had that long time ago, right? I can still remember the Constitutional Validities Act of 1865, for example, saying that states can amend their own constitutions. Okay? But he says, we suggest that this space, what space? Subnational constitutional space. And it's not subnational constitutionalism space, it's subnational constitutional space. Okay? That this space would be either wider or narrower, so there's elasticity there, depending on the range of discretion the national constitution provided for the component units to adopt their own constitutions. So I'm not going to go much into the critique now. That's what you will be doing in your research paper. But the point is, okay, I want you to engage with this concept that Robert identifies as subnational constitutional space. And he says this space is elastic, okay, and it could contract or expand depending on the discretion in the federal constitution. So he's assuming that there's discretion already. Okay? All right. Now, let's say choose another country, okay, and you want to confirm that with me, please. So just send me a quick email just to know that you are still alive and say, hi, I'm doing this research paper and I would like to choose these countries. What do you think? Okay. So here is what I propose. You can have the US. You can have the US, you can have Canada, and these are exactly the same constitutions you've looked at in the first assessment. Now, in this semester, if there's overlap, because there are 7 of you, or 6, if there's an overlap, I wouldn't mind. Okay? So if you all come back and say, oh, we're going to do it with the United States and Canada, I'd say, hoo-hoo, great, good for you. If one of you is more adventurous, or maybe they have connections with these Germanic countries, and we originally also have sort of a connection, at least 20% of my blood comes from that part of the world. So if you want to talk about it because of whatever reason you think that's relevant to you, you can also pick Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. So pick 2. If you are a JD student, sorry, let's just make sure that we got this right. If you are a JD student, you will have a two-way comparison, just like you did in the first assessment, just two-way. So Australia, and pick one. If you are a JD student, then you will have to pick two. Again, it's going to be a three-way comparison, again, just like you did for the first assignment. And we have our, excuse me, marking rubric. And again, the first of the criteria above will be weighted as shown on the rubric. So 40 out of the 50 marks are on those. And then the last of the criteria is simply 10 marks. And as you can see, the largest one component is your research. I think one of you put something on the forum. Where can I find the readings? Can I find the readings? I found the readings. That's great. But my point is, that's not the research. That's not your research component for the 20 marks. And as we said, if you want to get an HD, so I'll be sitting there looking at all of your 6 or 7 opinions or research papers, and I will pick the HD really out of that component there. The quality of your research, your engagement with the topic, and understanding how one piece of research will start leading you down a path of a chain, basically, until you get a different source. Okay. So the point is, the people for the A's and the HDs need to do some research. Okay. So let's go back then and continue with this presentation on subsidiarity. So we've been going now for 1 hour. Do you like to take a break for 5-10 minutes?
Yeah.
All right. Let's take a 5 to 10 minute break, and then we will come back and start our recording. I will leave rather our Zoom on, but I will stop the TechSmith recording for now. So talk to you again soon. All right. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our Seminar 1 recording here in Toowoomba. This is the 4th of December 2017, and we're going to continue our discussions in relation to subsidiarity. So I've just gone through the slide deck, and we looked at the assessments as a bird's eye view sort of the assessments. And now I just want to say more about subsidiarity, and I really hope that you will disagree with me. So don't just say, yep, that's what it is, that's what we're going to say, and then he's happy and we're done. No. That would give you really a C. If you really want to get a good grade, so B and above, you have to be very critical. And let's start our critical sort of analysis from your handbook. The emphasis is on the keyword start. Okay? So this is just the start of what we want to do, not the end. So let's see if I can find my handouts. I was hoping that everybody's going to show up, and then we're going to have a big party here, but it's just me and Chris, which is still good, it's still great. But I had like the handouts right here and everything. But again, as I said, that's why we are Zooming. Even the Zoom attracted only one person. Oh, no, it didn't attract anyone, that's me. So we're hoping still that maybe some will join us or not. So here is how it's going to work out. Okay, so let's start then from let's share this new share and share it on the screen. And that's where we're going to talk a little bit about your textbook. And the starting point is chapter 27, not textbook, your handbook. And it starts from why federalism. So they're trying to figure out, why would you have a federal system? What is the point there? And I want to drop to the second paragraph. It says, U.S. scholars and judges may shy away from using the term. What term? subsidiarity. So he's talking about the relationship between subsidiarity and federalism. Okay. So it says, but the key theoretical concept underlying a general theory of federalism is what Europeans call subsidiarity. Okay. And there's your explanation of where the word subsidium comes from and what it refers to previously. This is the footnote 70. Okay. And the key, I think, point there as well is that it says that this term subsidiarity, okay, entered our modern lexicon through the Catholic Church. So subsidiarity in that sense is actually related to the idea of religion. Okay. He gives you some more sort of citations there that you will find useful, and if you have brushed up on your German recently, the last one could also be of great use. Okay. Now, subsidiarity then is what they call, or what they use in the Catholic Church, okay, in relation to social organization. And this is recent. This was like in the 20th century, just before World War II, if I recall correctly. But subsidiarity has different names in different religious traditions. So the Protestants, for example, so the first problem with subsidiarity before we get there is that people don't want to use the word. Judges are going to go through a whole judgment without using that word, the S word. Same thing with US scholars, and I can add without hesitation most of the scholars in Australia. Okay. There are quite a few actually that talk about subsidiarity, but outside that circle, people don't really want to mention the word. In Protestantism, okay, they don't use the word subsidiarity. So that's the other problem with subsidiarity. Everyone refers to it by a different name. If they want to use it, it's going to even be by a different name. Those people, the Protestants call it spheres of sovereignty. Spheres of sovereignty. And you can even trace subsidiarity back to the Old Testament. Okay. You can trace it back to Leviticus and the idea of judges and Jethro's advice, okay, to Moses, okay, to appoint these judges, so sort of a way of devolution, rather in relation to law, because that was the law, rather than them coming to Moses for them to be able to get the law from him, except maybe for difficult questions of law. Religious, of course, law back then, because religion in the Durkheimian sense was the technology that manufactured their collective conscience. But the legal system was developed that way, through religious texts. All right, so let's go back to our page 585, and it says, to make it palatable to all, to all meaning whom? So because he doesn't want to go through Catholicism, he doesn't want to go through Protestantism, Judaism, whatever they want to call it, so let's make it religion neutral. we shall simply call it here the federal power principle. So he made subsidiarity into a principle, not a doctrine. That would be surprising, right? Because he said that judges shy away from using it. As a doctrine, when you say it's a doctrine, that means it's a legal principle, but it's a legal principle that has been developed over a long period of time through the court system. So common law development. That's what makes it a doctrine. Here, of course, he says, no, it's not a doctrine, we know. It's just a principle. So it's a legal theory. That's what we mean by a principle. It's a legal theory. It doesn't have much attraction yet to become a doctrine, maybe. But it's something that we can work with if there's an argument that relates to what subsidiarity applies to, say, in a court or in a legal context. But it's going to be really mostly about scholarship and about scholarly analysis. So he wants to call it the federal power principle. Others have called it different names. So when you do your research, you need to understand that you are not only researching the word subsidiarity. Bingo. That would limit your research to only the Catholic Church and only probably to legal writings in the context of the EU. Okay? So try to use other words, less used probably. You will probably get a lot of hits for subsidiarity, less maybe for spheres of sovereignty, and even less for this federal power principle, and less more even if you use the word hypotaxis. Because this actually subsidiarity is nothing more than grammatical principle or rule that you find in the structuring of sentences, say, in the English language. Okay? One of these clauses would be actually subsidiary or subordinate to the other. Hypotaxis comes again from the Greek language, but the good thing about it, I suppose, is that it is religion neutral. Okay, so we're not talking about any religious sort of influence or, in that sense, moral arguments to be made for subsidiarity. However, you will never be able to completely divorce subsidiarity from its moral genesis. Okay? So you'll always find that the distinctive feature or the deciding difference between subsidiarity and, say, economic models or economic theories or principles such as decentralization come really from that moral objective. So subsidiarity is not simply about reducing your organizational scales simply because you are looking for the one that would best sort of meet an objective criteria, a sufficiency objective. No, you need much more than that. You need more than that. You need to have under subsidiarity a normative signal, a moral signal, for which organizational structure should be the primary one. Okay. So if you go back and look at subsidiarity in the writings of Spinoza, for example, Baruch Spinoza, who was a Dutch philosopher, a Jewish Dutch philosopher, you will find that he talked about subsidiarity in terms of the Dutch Republic and the 7 provinces, and it was really more in the nature of confederation, and the chosen organizational scale was that of the city or the city region, so the city and its hinterland. Okay? So in that sense, if we want to apply that to today's Australia, okay, the Spinoza projection would be a city scale, for example, as Brisbane or Sydney or Melbourne, So it's going to be the city and its hinterland, okay, that would have the primacy as an organizational unit, or if you like, that's your Lego building block, where you can build everything using such city-size building blocks. In other writings, you'll find that it was the state that was the sort of primary or locus of attraction scale. And of course, when we got to nationalism, the rise of nationalism, which was really, if you want to think about it, the genesis of which could be traced back to the Lutheran Reformation. Okay, so we're talking 16th century something, from the 1520s. You can see writings, especially as they relate to England, where it shows that the evolution of this, the pride of the English as a nation can be traced back to that period, and from where we started seeing the evolution of nationalism as the dominant scale, or the nation as the dominant organization scale, when it came to the following centuries, especially the 18th century and the Industrial Revolution and so on. Leading up, of course, before that to the Peace of Westphalia and all of that. Okay, all right. Let's just move on a little bit more. So on the following page, it says there, so he's talking about subsidiarity, and he talks about it in terms of the blueprint for the US Constitution, and says the plan was to, the plan proposed that the central legislature, so the federal government, be given the power to legislate in all cases to which the separate states, the United States, are incompetent, or in which the harmony of the United States may be interrupted by the exercise of individual legislation. Okay? Let's just unpack those 2 points, because we are trying here to figure out for your first assignment, what's the relationship between subsidiarity and federalism, and what is actually happening in jurisdictions such as Canada, and if you are doing the JD, Canada and the US. Okay? Here we're talking about the US. So it says here that there was a plan. Okay? This is in relation to drafting the. It came to be known as the Randolph Plan for a blueprint for the US Constitution. The first point, they said, we want to actually move the powers to this federal or central legislature, okay, where the states, okay, are incompetent doing so. Okay. So Chris, I have to pick on you. What is the nature of this claim? He says that the Randolph Plan was about, just to make sure that he's Randolph, yeah. Randolph Plan was about, so the criteria is, if this is the test, if the states are incompetent, then that power should be, the power to legislate on that matter should be given to the central legislature. Do you agree with this statement or disagree with the statement, or what can you say about the statement?
Well, it's probably the opposite of what drove federalism in Australia.
So you're saying our federalism was driven by something that was the exact opposite.
Maybe not the exact opposite, but...
So you're saying that we said devolve, is that what you're saying? You're saying we devolve the power to the states if they are competent?
To a certain extent, I think that is correct, yes. Because the
So the default position.
The default position in Australia is the opposite. Is states have competency for everything, and the federal government has competency only in a specific list of things.
Okay. So Chris saying his argument is that it's about the default position. If we want to compare the US with Australia, you'll find that this US argument has a default position where things are going to be given to the central legislature. Unless the states are competent, then that could be devolved to them. Is that your reading of this sentence? And if it's in Australia, then it's the exact opposite, in the sense that the default position is going to be that the states are going to be competent, and if they are not competent, then that would be what we would give to the federal government. But here's my point. In designing our constitution, what motivated us into having the exclusive powers, like the defense power, that were given, for example, to the federal government? Why did you choose to give those powers to the federal government? Was it not because the states were incompetent?
On certain matters, I think, yes. Things like defence.
What about...
I mean, the states were not incompetent when it came to setting trade. It's just that they thought there was a higher ideal in delegating that, or upward delegating that power to the new federation. So there's a mixture of both.
Let's look at the second argument then. He makes two arguments, right? The first one about incompetence. The second one says in which the harmony of the states may be interrupted by the exercise of individual legislation. Do you think defense was given to the federal government in Australia because the states were incompetent, or a bit of both?
Probably more the latter.
More the latter, because if I give it to the states, there would be in harmony. There would be in harmony even in terms of the gauge of railways. So imagine if you're going to leave the defense to these states, separate states, and then you're going to decide to wage a war or to defend the country in collaboration of all of those states. So definitely the idea of having collaboration at the end of it is going to be more expensive than having it at the beginning. So, all right. Okay, let's just leave that there, and we'll come back to that later on. All right, let's go to page 592, and let's talk about subsidiarity redux or redo, instrumental or intrinsic. Okay, and what are they talking about there? So they still raise this idea of the principle of federal power on page 592. They rehash some of the points about the Randolph Plan, and then they jump into page 593, and we see the sentence there. Second paragraph starts, but subsidiarity is easier said than applied. Okay? So he's talking about difficulties in the concept itself. That's why probably it's a principle, not a doctrine. But the idea is that as a theory, it still has difficulties. Okay? And he talks about further difficulties, and one of which, of course, is what Chris raised earlier in the seminar in relation to politics. So he says, the authors say, many of these arguments will raise questions of first principle that cannot be resolved absent politics. Okay? And then they talk about the idea of externalities. The idea of externalities, of course, is an economic concept, and it basically means that there's a transaction between two parties, and you would be affected by that transaction even though you didn't agree or disagree with them. So someone decides to build a factory next door to you, and it ends up actually emitting toxins into the atmosphere, and you would be affected by that even though you haven't said anything about whether yes or no to build that factory, assuming that there was no consultation process and so on. So that would be a negative externality on your behalf. and compare, for example, someone who comes and builds parks in your city, and you don't have to pay for it because you're a new immigrant that just arrived. That would be a positive externality because you can enjoy all of this infrastructure without having to pay for it beforehand. That's what we mean by externalities, positive and negative. Okay. Let's drop to the middle of the page, and it talks about, so let's just look at it here. So I want to start from somewhere here. It says gay marriage, okay, physician-assisted suicide, was also known as euthanasia. You must have heard this recently, at least if you're in Victoria. And the use of medical marijuana have all made it rather onto the national agenda of politics in the United States, in large part due to the ideological objections voiced outside the jurisdictions in which these policies were instituted. So if these policies, say, were instituted by the Dutch have all three long time ago, then objections raised in terms of bring about these constitutional changes in a way to the Netherlands eventually made that become a live topic for discussion and debate and scholarly research, and eventually other jurisdictions adopted those changes. So when we talk about comparative constitutions or comparative law generally, then we need also to invoke this other idea of legal transplants. Okay? And legal transplants give us this perspective that there would be in fact a diffusion of ideas over time. Okay? And that of course applies also to constitutions. So you'll find that many of the provisions or sections in our Commonwealth Constitution and other constitutions come in fact from the United Kingdom, or if not directly from there, they were definitely influenced by things like the British North America Act of 1867, which is of course the starting point for the, actually even before that, the British North American Act of 1840, which was the Act of Union in Canada, and then of course the British, again, North America Act of 1867, and finally the American Constitution of 1791, and so on and so forth. So all of these constitutions influenced us in Australia in some way or another, and we adopted our provisions from there. The latest referendum, of course, on gay marriages, and the recent legislation on euthanasia in Victoria, and the ongoing medical marijuana trials and legislation shows how we are influenced as much as anyone else by these transplants or this diffusion. Okay? How is this all relating then to subsidiarity? So he's giving you these examples as propositions for what he referred to as externalities. Okay? So the idea says that our subsidiarity has difficulties. Okay? It has first principle difficulties, and they can't be resolved absent politics. Now you have to think then about how these examples were all affected by politics. Okay? So how do we know when these externalities would make a difference? So he says every policy affects interests beyond its jurisdictional boundaries, even if only because outsiders who know about the policy do not like it. So that's the point here. Okay? And then you have to ask yourself, once we have started this debate, okay, in relation to such externalities, i.e. these ideas that are coming to us from further afield, not because we like them, sometimes simply because we say, oh, look at what they have done, you know. The last I've checked, for example, is that in the Netherlands, okay, with the approval of the person's parents, you can get married, or at least a girl can get married for as young as 14. That's something that the Netherlands decided to enact. Now, you don't like this idea. This is pedophilia, right? So you go and write about it. You have an op-ed, or you just go online and blog about it somewhere. And more people do the same, and then it has the snowballing effect and becomes a critical mass where people actually talk about on national TV, or it's a news item. And that's the really starting point where we see this evolution of these ideas from being rejected, okay, and then through this debating process, or if you like, fermentation, where it could become more acceptable, at least, to more or larger sections of the population. And of course, as you know, law is made by society today. It's not by a religious textbook. It's what society wants. And that applies as well to any piece of legislation, including a constitution. Okay? Let's just talk a little bit about this, what he refers to as the million harm principle. Okay? He talks about the million harm principle. He says, is of little help here, as it does not come with ready-made content. So the million harm principle is referred to at the bottom on footnote 116. He refers you to John Stuart Mill on liberty. Okay? And I summarize this principle as the power can be exercised over an individual, but only to prevent harming others. Okay? So the idea is, what kind of harm would these externalities impose on others? If that's something we can use as a principle to inform our political discussions. Okay, and he's saying that's not of much use here, because there's not ready-made content. So basically, we don't really know, what type of harm or what kind of harm could actually come from these externalities. Now, you recall when we started the referendum process on the gay marriage question in Australia, they were very sort of nasty, probably. I'm just saying what was termed by some as nasty TV ads on both sides. And some of those ads were actually referring to the experience in other countries. So they were trying to provide content to this harm principle. So they were saying that this thing was tried or trialed in such and such country, in the US, for example, and that then led, they believe, to what they don't accept as a new bench sort of mark for education of children. So they thought that the sexual education of children became more about much more liberal, if you like, basing your sexual attitudes on what you like or what you believe you are, because of this sort of institutionalization of marriage, of gay marriage in that country. But I'm just saying that that's what you would see there happening in terms of fleshing out that content. And again, all of this relates to subsidiarity in the idea that it has a difficulty because there are certain questions that we cannot decide without talking politics. Okay. Let's look at the paragraph that starts with what is often. So it says, what is often overlooked is that this basic question bedevils most arguments in favor of central or local authority. Okay. So here's what we're talking about. You recall that we started saying that in the Rodolph plan, they said that there are two arguments for subsidiarity. One is where the states are incompetent, or where the harmony between these states would be weakened if you were to put the locus of power at the state level. And now we're saying, okay, there's a problem still with this idea of where you want to put the authority because of externalities. So if you put, for example, this power of marriage legislation, okay, at the state level, then one state would go ahead and legislate for gay marriage. What do you think is that's going to do? Then that's going to create an externality, not negative or positive, but I'm just saying there would be an externality in the sense, for example, that New South Wales would then start debating this process. Have we seen something of that nature already in Australia in terms of euthanasia? Chris?
Yes.
So, Victoria has already legislated to legalize euthanasia. That then becomes an externality, positive or negative, to, for example, Queensland and New South Wales. So they would both be sitting there and looking at it and saying, well, what we should do. Okay? And is that what you think would actually improve the harmony of these states working together in that space? Or should this kind of legislation be limited, to the federal level and not be the remit of the individual and different states? That's what we're talking about here. There's more in relation to transaction costs, which is also something related to externalities. This is not a separate, really, argument. Just think of it as fleshing out more what happens when you have externalities. Because externalities simply mean that you would either benefit from that transaction that happened in Victoria, i.e. the legislation to legalize euthanasia, benefit from that legislation without paying the cost for it, because you don't live there, or you pay the price for it, okay, again, without agreeing that you have to pay that kind of price. Someone has finally joined us. That's Julia Yu. Nice meeting you, Julia. And we are continuing with our seminar at the moment. Feel free to interrupt if you have any questions. We were hoping to finish around 3 o'clock, but we'll see how it goes. And I'm just continuing now with my reading of parts of your handbook. So we are on page 593. So it says here, consider the simple case of transactions costs. Okay. They are worth reducing only, of course, if we have agreed on the goal we are trying to pursue. Okay. So he's saying we can't start talking about the economics of it before agreeing on what to do. So I want to go to, what's my favorite city in the world? Let's say Paris. I want to go to Paris. Okay? Now, once we have agreed that that's my goal, we start thinking of the efficiency of getting there. How fast do you get there? How much do you want to pay to get there? And so on and so forth. But if we don't agree on which place to go to, I want to go to Paris. My wife, for example, wants to go to, I don't know, let's say Venice. Okay? Then we can't start talking about how to get there before we agree on where we're going. That's what they're saying here. Otherwise, high transactions costs may indeed be a welcome safeguard against policies we dislike. So he's saying, if we don't like euthanasia, then if it's actually difficult for us to be able to legislate for euthanasia, because, for example, we don't have the power to do so. One way of increasing the transaction costs is to make that decision making somewhere else, which means that you then have to go and lobby the federal government and pay all of that cost before you can effect a change. Of course, you'll still be probably lobbying even at the state level, but we're talking about the relativities here. So I'm saying it would be more if it's at the federal level. So they say intra-jurisdictional difficulties to create harm only to the extent that we view the particular form of hi Julia.
Oh, hi.
Do you want to say something?
Sorry, sorry to interrupt. I just walked into the classroom.
No, that's perfectly fine. But please make sure that you mute while we're talking. If you want something, just let me know. Unmute and let me know. Thanks. All right. So we were just saying here that there are intra-jurisdictional difficulties that create harm only to the extent that we view the particular form of interjurisdictional politics we are trying to cure as problematic. So I'm still talking about this idea that politics cannot be divorced from the idea of where you want the decision to be made. Okay? And this idea of intra-jurisdictional politics within the same jurisdiction that will also give rise to these kind of politics. So an example, when African Americans are excluded, okay, from the franchise, the answer is easy. But whether felon disenfranchisement at the component state level compromises rather the local democratic process already generated little agreement in the United States. Okay. So he's saying basically when that kind of topic comes up as a news item on the national arena, in the national space, it has a different outcome than if you pitch it or you maybe disguise it that it is simply something that is pertaining to a particular jurisdiction. Okay. What's the difference between the two? You have to remember, of course, that felonies or the felons in the US are mostly from which ethnic background? Most of the people that end up in jails in the US are actually Africans. But again, it depends on how you flesh or how you want to debate this issue. Okay. Now, let's drop down to the point that it says here. Okay, it says to the question. So it says, talking about Dahl, and if you're familiar with Dahl, he's basically a political scientist that talks mainly about the composition or the design of political organizations, polities, and what will be basically the optimal size of these subnational components of the country. Okay? So mostly empirical work in political science, but he observed with regards to the question of how to determine the proper boundaries of a democratic polity. Okay? So he says democratic ideas do not yield a definitive answer. To what? To the boundaries. Okay? So he's saying even if you are a democratic country, that in itself doesn't really tell us how big or how small your boundaries within the states are going to be, i.e. the subnational sort of components of this polity, but also doesn't tell us who should do what in terms of the power relationship between these components. So he says they presuppose, the democratic ideas that is, these ideas presuppose that one has been somehow been supplied. Presuppose that one has been somehow been supplied, okay, by history and politics. So he's saying the boundaries must come from somewhere external to the model. So our discourse, our analysis are going to take that as a given. So we know, for example, a famous example of that is that of Quebec. Okay, so in Canada, you'll find that their type of federalism is in fact known as asymmetric. Asymmetric as opposed to symmetric. So it's not symmetric. And why do we say that the federal or the federal model in Canada is asymmetric? We say it's asymmetric because of history and politics. What do we mean by that? We mean that Canada was, at least the eastern side of Canada, was colonized first by the French. Okay? I come from New Zealand as well because I lived there for 15 years and I'm a New Zealand citizen. And I was telling Chris before that, Julia, that I come also from Israel, the northern part of Israel, and some German heritage as well. But I was saying that in Canada, the French started the colonization of the eastern side. Well, that might not be historically completely accurate, but there was this tension or competition between the French and the British. And that then resulted later on in an asymmetric federalism as we see today in Canada. So just like we were talking about Catalonia and just like we were talking about Kurdistan, we say that Quebec presents this secession sort of pressures on the federal system in Canada, and that's what we mean there by that this boundary. So we know now that then Quebec wants to be actually the decision maker on almost everything. So in terms of their education policy, in terms of their health policy, so that boundary then, and this idea of subsidiarity, at least in the sense of devolving the decision making to Quebec, is nothing that came out from our discussions. It's not something that we had much to say about. It has been already decided for us by history and politics. Now, let's drop down to the next paragraph. It says, in trying to apply the federal power principle to concrete cases, here we go. So let's talk about Australia. We want to apply subsidiarity to Australia. We don't have a Quebec in Australia, do we? The closest that we got was actually something in New Zealand. Okay, in the southern east coast, and the east coast of the South Island, in a place called Akarua, close to Christchurch, okay, where the French tried to establish something similar to a Quebec, and they were, of course, trumped or defeated quickly by the declaration of the Federation of Tribes of New Zealand, the predecessor that had even its own proper flag, not proper flag, but it was a different flag, and then it was really the predecessor to what came as the Kingdom of New Zealand. The question is, do we have something similar to that here in Australia? Do we have a Quebec in Australia? Or is Australian federalism simply symmetric? Nicholas Aroney, who also teaches constitutional law at the University of Queensland, has very specific views on that. He's one of our leading constitutional scholars, and he basically says no, or maybe yes, because he starts from the proposition that we don't have that really breakdown or the separation of different ethnicities in Australia. Well, at least not in terms of the colonizers. Okay. But when you start taking into account the indigenous jurisprudential mixture, okay, you might then see that in fact Australia has a lot of asymmetry. Although of course the current or existing system is completely symmetric, and it has to be so based on the Commonwealth Constitution. Okay, let's go back to saying, in trying, this last paragraph on this page, it says, in trying, it was still on page 593, in trying to apply, by the way, I will upload actually all of these pages as part of the seminar on the study desk as soon as we finish here. So it says here, in trying to apply the federal power principle, and as we said previously, for this author, the power principle, the federal power principle, so this is Daniel Halberstam from the US, from Ann Arbor, from Michigan, one of the best universities, or better universities, law universities there. So he says, in trying to apply the federal power principle, so what he means by the federal power principle, just for Julia's benefit, it was discussed earlier on page 492, and we started the discussion on page 585 when he said that I'm not going to use the word subsidiarity. I don't like this word, maybe because it has a Catholic sort of connotation. I don't know why he doesn't like it, but he simply says judges and scholars don't use it as much. Let's have something more neutral. And his idea for neutral was to come up with this concept, the federal power principle. So this is just 4 words to simply say subsidiarity. So in trying to apply subsidiarity to concrete cases, it can therefore be useful to distinguish between 2 kinds of arguments. Remember Paris and Venice? So he's saying, if we agree on the goal, the first are instrumental arguments, which presuppose agreement on the goal or interest to be achieved. So we all agree we're going to go to Paris, then this idea of subsidiarity and its implementation is only instrumental. It's just simply how to get there. So we have identified already that we have a Quebec. And we know that Quebec wants to have its own separate constitutional space. Then subsidiarity is simply going to be, well, how can we arrange that for them? Because we know what we want. We know the boundary already. With a wild stretch of imagination, we can say the same maybe about the Wexit. So this idea that they keep kicking down the road of this possibility of having Western Australia become its own separate country. If we agree on that goal, then subsidiarity would simply say how we can get there. Maybe not necessarily as a separate country, because subsidiarity wouldn't be relevant in that instance, but at least if we talk about how we can asymmetrize the symmetry of the Australian Federation. So instead of just keeping this federation as a symmetric sort of polity, why can't we then instead have this polity become asymmetric? So we start treating different states differently, okay? Because we know that, so if we agree on the goal that Western Australia is different, then the goal is to treat it differently, and then subsidiarity would help us get there. That's the first argument where he talks about this idea of instrumentality, okay? Instrumentality. And then there's the second argument, just at the bottom of that page. It says the second kind of arguments is intrinsic. So it could be, subsidiarity could be in fact intrinsic. And that means what? We have to even debate the goals themselves. So we still don't even agree on whether we want to go to Paris or to Venice. We really want to first decide what should be the sort of preferred or the focus of our subsidiarity analysis. Is it going to be something like Quebec? Is it going to be something like Queensland? Is it going to be something like Brisbane City and its region? What is the scale that we will look at in order for us to decide whether something like a decision, like euthanasia, for example, is going to be at that level or at a central level or even as a meso level? Yeah, it depends again on how far you want to go with that. These arguments ask which level of government has the better claim to determine the goals and interests in the first place. So that's then when you start looking at something more in terms of economic analysis, say efficiency as an objective, and you start asking yourself, if we decentralize, okay, let's take out the moral content of the argument. So we don't want to talk about subsidiarity. We just say, if we decentralize, is that going to give us any cost savings or cost benefits? Would it be cheaper to do it at the local level or at the federal level? And then you start talking about costs, such as the costs, for example, of coordination, the cost of information, and things like the cost of economies of scale, okay, or scope, and so on. All right. Okay, so maybe I just want to share as well something on page 995. So it says there, somewhere at the bottom of the page there, so it says many, so start from this point here, many of these subsidiarity questions, the ones that we're just talking about, turn on conceptually simple. So this is the simple question of whether we want to put it at a certain organization level, whether it's the local or the national. So that's simple. But when it comes to the questions themselves, because of what we talked about in the difficulties, especially things like externalities and the politics, it says empirically, these are complex questions about instrumental rationality. Okay? So the idea of actually using subsidiarity to achieve an objective, if we agree at least on the goal that we are after, require complex empirical evidence. So it's difficult for you to bring evidence. You can ask Dal, the person I was talking about earlier, the political scientist. It's very difficult to get empirical evidence to say, you see, in that country, that was the best organizational structure. That was the best organizational level. Something that comes to mind is a study was made in the 1970s in Italy about something called social capital. Okay? Social capital. And the study was basically to see, at the time at least, whether the constitutional, new at the time, arrangements to devolve powers to the regions, okay, would have actually made a difference, i.e. in terms of benefit in relation to at least cost savings. Now you know that Italy, even recently, continues down that path of devolution. We have seen it in Sicily, and we've seen it as well in Emilia-Romagna and in the Northern League. Okay, but again, that's the idea. Once you start this ball rolling, you never know if this is going to be the floodgates argument, because slowly and slowly they might decide eventually to secede, what we saw in Catalonia. Anyway, all right. So let's just go back and say, it says here, many of these subsidiarity questions turn on empirically complex questions, but other subsidiarity decisions turn on substantive claims about national interests. Okay? National interests and local prerogatives that cannot be solved absent moral arguments or argumentation and political contest. Now remember, I talked about Kurdistan, at least before you joined us, Julia, and what we were talking about there was this idea. I was just saying something about Kurdistan and the idea that the Iraqi central government decided to take away the powers that were given to this region by the constitution, the federal constitution, because of the results of a referendum that they have conducted earlier this year, and upon which they wanted to secede from Iraq. They wanted to have their own country. That's when these things such as national interest kick in, and the same thing, of course, with Catalonia. You'll find the same thing even in Scotland and many other places around the world. Okay. So I think I will just leave that there then. Maybe I just go to page 607 quickly. We'll leave it there then. 607 says the conclusion, okay, and brings this idea of Proudhon, who was a French, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who was a French anarchist. Anarchy basically says that you don't want to have a government. Maybe you can massage it a little bit and say libertarianism, where you probably still have a government, but it's a very small government. So it doesn't really have something to do with the definition of marriage, for example. And the question to start with is, why in the first place is the government in my bedroom? You know, why do you have a marriage act in the first place? And then why would you then have to change that definition? Okay. Proudhon. He says, the 20th century, which has passed already, let's see if he were predicting what actually went on, whether he was right or not. He says, the 20th century will open the age of federations, or else humanity will undergo another purgatory of 1,000 years. Okay? Did that happen? Did we see a proliferation of federations in this world? So, basically it says, how the destruction wrought in the 20th century compares to purgatory is anyone's guess. But the age of federations has certainly come. Okay? Federalism, as a normative idea, has captured the imagination of political theory, and federalism as a concrete institutional arrangement has proven useful and reasonably enduring around the world. That doesn't help us at all, at least in terms of our assessments, because we want to see the relationship between federalism and subsidiarity. So drop to the next paragraph at the middle, the third line. He says there, this chapter turned to articulating rather a succinct, general normative theory of federalism. That's what he refers to as subsidiarity, or what he refers to also as the federal power principle. Okay? A succinct, general normative theory of federalism. So just to be sure, when you do your first assessment, you don't just say, oh, that's what this guy says. Daniel says this, then that's the holy truth. This is what Daniel says. What do you say? That's where the A and the HDs come from. You might say, I disagree with this guy. Why? You might even disagree with me. We'll see soon. Arguing in favor of the local under minimal conditions of diversity, as for example in Australia, we find familiar claims of greater democratic voice. So he's saying, if we want to have subsidiarity implemented in Australia so that we can have more powers devolved, say, to Queensland, how would you justify that? Because we are all the same. We're all Australians. So why would you have to have that? You know, if we are going to have gay marriage legalized in Australia, we're all going to legalize the same thing, right? And even if Victoria is going to legalize euthanasia, then of course we're going to end up all legalizing the same, right? And then the question is, he says, arguing in favor of such devolution or subsidiarity, okay, to the local level, okay, we find claims such as greater democratic voice. So we would have greater democratic voice as Queenslanders if that decision is made locally. Or solidarity. Okay. Now you will find mostly, you'll end up finding it difficult not to discuss solidarity when you discuss solidarity in your paper, because really they are very related terms. Okay. And solidarity would be something that has to do with intra-jurisdictional cohesion, if you like, or harmony, as we talked about it earlier. And how you would actually fracture that solidarity by migrating the decision-making to higher and higher organization levels, such as the national or even the supranational levels, such as, for example, the EU or other organizations such as the WTO and so on. arguments in favor of central power, he continues, can be usefully grouped into the three categories of cost savings. So when we talk about the fifth question in your assessment, the first assessment, and if there are arguments in favor of federation in terms of the idea that that federation then will give us the possibility of migrating some of the decisions to a central power, then you might want to talk about that in terms of these arguments, either cost savings or the interjurisdictional difficulties. So you can link it to that harmony idea between the states, or the intra-jurisdictional difficulties, which is akin or similar to the discussion we had in terms of state competency. Now, I don't want to take too much of your time, so I want to just go down quickly to some other stuff that I want to say, and then maybe we'll finish off around 3:30. So we'll just continue recording, I hope. And it says here, recommended readings. So you'll find that I've given you two of my papers. Now, just a warning, I don't put up these slides usually. I don't put up these slides on study desk, but this time around, I'll put them up there. And I hope that you can find these readings on your own. Now, don't worry too much whether you can find them or not, or you're going to use them or not. That doesn't matter. You still can get an HD without engaging these readings. It's just recommended readings. But they might open the door for you to be able to articulate these questions, the 5 questions in your first assessment, in a better way. That's all. Now, I just want to bring your attention to some stuff on the internet, some stuff happening in the space. There's something called the Comparative Constitutions Project. Okay? This is from the University of Chicago by one of the probably most prominent comparative constitutionalists of his time, still alive. His name is Tom Ginsburg, and he has gone through this project to compare all of these constitutions. Go and have a look-see, because you might find there that you can excuse me, pick on some of the dimensions of similarity and difference between constitutions in an instant, because he brings up things in relation, for example, to federalism and so on, in a comparative sort of window for you, that you can see immediately the relevant sections in different constitutions. Have a look-see. All right. Second thing I want to talk about is this event that's going to come. This one is the one in Korea. That's going to come later in 2018, rather, in June 2018. This is a World Congress, people. So this is basically something that happens only once every 4 years. And it's the creme de la creme that go to such conferences. In fact, you cannot become a member of the IACL unless you have a recommendation. First, you have to be a member of your own, so the Australian Constitutional Law Association. And then you will have to be nominated for this international association, and then you could become part of the World Congress. But if you want to go and present, or you're going to go and attend, you can still, of course, go and register and be part of that. In particular, one of the workshops that are going to be in this World Congress is going to be about subnational constitutionalism, or subnational federations, workshop 27. So if you're interested, you can also have a look-see if you can go to these World Congresses or not. Again, it depends on your future career plans in this space. All right. Then there's also, just a month after that, in Japan, that's the second Congress I want to talk about. It's a World Congress, again, once every 4 years. And this is going to be the Congress of the International Academy of Comparative Law. So that's the World Congress for the Constitutional Law. This is the World Congress for Comparative Law. As you can see, they are done in the same year, around the same time, because, again, of the possibilities of interaction or people being interested in contributing to both. All right. So let me just continue then a few. What do you think, Chris? Do you want to have another break, or do you want to just keep going? Okay, let's keep going. Julia, are you okay?
Yes, please go ahead.
All right. So let's continue then and start talking a little bit about the cover of your handbook. Okay, very interesting cover. This comes actually from a tableau called The Ideal City, okay, of Urbino, Italy. There are different stories, different versions as to who actually created it, but I just want to put this out there and see what you think about this painting, basically. Is it something that's missing? Is there anything missing here? Or how do you see it? So, in the book, why did they use this as the cover for the handbook? So, in the book, they say the plan of the city is its constitution. So they make an analogy between a polity and a city. Okay. Okay. So as I said, I come originally from Israel, although don't have great sort of expectations as to my Hebrew language skills, but we know that Israel is called Dawlat Israel. Okay. Sorry, Medinat Yisrael. Medinat Israel is actually, if you look at Medinat, you can argue that the word Medinat, especially if you compare it to Arabic, it has the origins of the meaning of a city. So the state of Israel, which should be translated as the state of Israel, is actually spelled or referred to as the city of Israel. Okay? So here the analogy is similar. Okay? We're saying that the city represents the state, and the plan for that city, as you see it in front of you in this painting, represents the constitution for the state. And as you can see, the painting shows you different buildings, okay, and how they sort of relate to each other, or how they are positioned vis-a-vis each other. So you can think of these as the institutions or the powers. Okay? What's missing from this title? So it says constitutional orders depend on institutions. Yeah. So we have the institutions there. What's missing? Chris? Yeah. So Chris picks up on the idea that there are no people. Excuse me, because I'm too close to the other audience phones. So he says there are no people. Okay? What do you think, Julia? So this is pretty much an ideal type. Okay? It's an ideal type. So if you compare it to this ideal city, still an ideal city, but you can see now that this painting has people. So the idea here is that constitutions, okay, need to construct rather more than mere structures. Okay? So the constitution is not simply about sections or chapters. It's also about the architecture. So the idea of how these sections are put into practice. Now I started this seminar talking about the Law 8001 module that some of you might have taken with Dr. Jeremy Patrick, in relation to the methodology of comparative law. Okay? And we said there, or he said there, that you need to emphasize this idea of functionality or functional equivalence. So the idea is not that we are going to look at one city and look at the other city and look at Rome and say, oh, look, they have the Colosseum there. And we look at Paris and we say they don't have a Colosseum, they have the Eiffel Tower. Okay, that's not comparative analysis. Comparative analysis is to say, oh, look, the Colosseum is close, for example, to a certain gate or a certain other institution or building. And they're juxtaposed in that way. and then you look at another city and say, oh, it's the same thing in that city. For example, you look at the place where they have their city hall, vis-a-vis, for example, where they have the markets, or the traditional, at least, plaza, and so on and so forth. So what you are looking at is how these institutions perform a certain function more than simply that they look the same. Okay? Because, as I said, okay, if you want to get to Paris, there are many different ways getting there. What we are interested in is how these different roads or different functional sort of structures or designs lead us to the same place. Or is it the same place? Are these two constitutions you're looking at, for example, in your first assessment when you look at Australia and Canada? Okay? Are these two countries in relation to subsidiarity and federalism, okay, functionally equivalent? Okay. There's a lot about the history of the comparative constitutional law movement. Okay, it started really with Plato talking about ideal types. So we just saw some ideal types, but of course, as I said, that's not comparative. When we compare, we're not comparing Australia to an ideal type and then comparing Canada and or the United States to that same ideal type. You could, okay? So you'd be able to sort of structure a model, and I usually sometimes do so. You would actually create a model and then test, whatever features you're looking at in the constitutions you are studying against that model. Okay? But Plato started with this idea of ideal type. Then Aristotle came and compared real states with abstract forms. So that's what I was just talking about now. This Aristotelian idea of creating a model or an abstract form and then looking at these different states vis-a-vis or relative to that form. We have Machiavelli, okay, and he started now comparison over time. So he was actually comparing new or contemporary states with old or historical states. Okay. All right. And then we have Montesquieu, probably the most relevant to our movement, the CC or comparative movement at the moment. And he basically started the empirical historical comparisons for providing a signal as to what is the best design or best way of achieving a certain function, a constitutional function. All right. Then we come to the US and French revolutions. So this is where the comparative constitutionalism became more relevant, okay? Because now you have new organizational models and you wanted to be able to refine or redesign your constitutions. So there was this idea of an inspiration or a legitimation of your choices. That's of course also what happened in Australia in the 1890s during the constitutional conferences, where we ended up having comparisons, especially with Canada, the US, and Switzerland. Okay. And then you have on page 4 some of the sort of more prominent researchers in this field, historically at least. So you have Mill, you have Constant, Tocqueville, Eötvös, and Dicey. Then we come to the 19th century with legal positivism. And because it's legal positivism, what does that mean? It means that what's law is what is decided at the end of the day by the people. by society. So how come then my society has anything to do with what's happening with the Netherlands, for example, and if they decide to legalize euthanasia? So that was the 19th century. They are them, we are us, has nothing to do with us. It's only inspirational or aspirational in the sense that, oh, look what they are doing other places, or maybe that's a good idea for us to aspire to or maybe work towards in the future. Okay? That was 19th century. Then we come to 1869, the birth in Paris of the Société de Législation. Excuse me, my French is very good, so don't judge me on that. Société de Législation Comparée, and so it's about basically the Society of Comparative Legislation or Comparative Law. Okay, and 30 odd years after that, we find our first international conference on comparative law. So the predecessor of what I've just talked about in Japan, in Japan in relation to the International Academy of Comparative Law, the World Congress. Okay. Then in the 1920s, we find that the movement, the constitutional or comparative constitutional law movement, became a separate scholarly discipline. Now note, I'm talking about comparative constitutional law. Okay, I'm not talking about comparative law. That might have a more pedigree in terms of its establishment as a separate discipline. Okay. All right. And then we continue with this historical account of how we got ourselves into a comparative constitutional law movement. Okay. I suppose the most important things is the last two. So in the 1970s, comparative constitutions became really part of legal education and comparative law generally. Okay, at least in the US, maybe not really as much in the US as much as it is actually in Europe. And then we find that in the 1990s, so after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the breakdown of the Soviet Union, we find that now the importance of comparisons became to the point that comparison of constitutions became a new method of legal interpretation. Don't say that or tell that to our High Court of Australia, especially after the judgment in the Citizenship 7. Okay, so this is the Canavan and the other 7, Joyce and all of them, that went to the High Court. They wanted to see if these guys were in violation of Section 44 of the Constitution, or more specifically of Section 44, subsection 44(1) of the Constitution, or more specifically the citizenship limb, okay, of section or subsection 44(1). And of course, the court was alerted to the historical comparisons between that section and the boilerplate sections that were found, or on which it was actually even drafted in relation first in Australia to the subnational constitutions of that time. So we're talking about the subnational constitution in Queensland in the 1890s, when they were sitting down to draft this section. And they were also alerted to the similarities between the section and its origins, again, from Canada, the constitutional, federal constitution of Canada, again in the 1840s and the 1860s, 1867. And they were also alerted to the relationship of that with what happened in New Zealand. Okay, so none of that was really of interest. They didn't want to hear of it. It never actually impacted their legal interpretation. They stuck to the guns. They stuck to that very, really dry approach in relation to a very textual interpretation, and no more. Not even the purposive approach, not even, of course, this comparative constitutions approach. To the effect, of course, of what we saw in terms of the financial burden that was put on the government, and again in terms of the uncertainties that somehow they seem to be actually alert to and wanting to so navigate in terms of the outcome of the case. But that's what we have there. So if you want to get something out of that, comparative constitutional law is a big deal in Europe. Comparative constitutional law is a big deal in the US. Much, 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 much less so in Australia and even New Zealand, and probably in much of Asia, I would say. Latin America has a more sort of openness towards it, simply because they had to go through exercises recently of redrafting their constitutions. So you see, in Asia, not many people are going around saying, oh, we need a new constitution. Okay? But in Latin America, like in Bolivia and Ecuador, for example, okay, they drafted new constitutions in the 1990s, or even after that. Okay? So that's why I say that they would have more emphasis on that. Okay. Let's look at some of the uses, purposes, and challenges of comparative constitutionalism or comparative constitutional law. There are four principal uses. Okay? The first one is constitution making. I've just alluded to the point that some countries are going out there shopping for constitutions. They have to rewrite their constitution. They have to have something, for example, like a revolution, or what happened like in the Arab Spring, for example, in places like Egypt or Tunisia, or even in Turkey for that matter. So they have to go through constitutional making. Okay? That's one area where you'd go, oh, let's look at other constitutions and see what they have done and what kind of approach they have used for what kind of functions, and whether that would be the best approach for us to use for that function. Second most important one of uses is constitutional interpretation. And I can't really underestimate how important this is. Okay? You definitely need to be able to look at other constitutions, especially the ones that were available for the drafters of our, for example, federal constitution at the time where they have been looking at, for example, the Constitutional Bill of 1891. Because that's when you see that they were thinking, if I can use then that kind of approach, it would give me the same functional equivalence that I saw happening in those other foreign constitutions. The HCA completely ignores, of course, what I'm saying, and they don't want to hear of it. That's nothing to do with Australia. In other countries, yes, it does. Then you have descriptive accounting. So that constitutions project that I talked about with Tom Ginsberg from Chicago, the Chicago Law School, talks about this descriptive accounting, because he also goes in and gives you some sort of scores. So he comes up with actually scores for all national constitutions of the world in terms of certain functionalities or features. The last thing, of course, is the prescriptive assessments. Okay? Descriptive, prescriptive, or if you like, normative. Okay? The idea that this is what they are doing in the Netherlands. You know, look at their constitution, how it's done. Look at this, look at that. One thing that became very, for example, relevant, I thought, in recent years was this idea of giving the indigenous population or giving First Nations, okay, representation on either subnational or national constitutions, subnational or national legislative bodies. Okay, so whether you want to have indigenous Australians be represented in the Queensland Parliament, or you want them to be represented in the Commonwealth Parliament. Then some people, meaning me, looked at the constitution in New Zealand. Okay, and we saw that there they actually have something between 5 to 7 seats that are basically reserved for Maori. Of course, New Zealand is really a very minimalist state. They have only one chamber. They have only one unicameral sort of legislature. So there's no upper house. And it's, of course, only in terms of the Australian Federation, it represents only one state. But they still have this provision where they have the seats for the Maori in the parliament. And of course, someone like, something to also please remember is that New Zealand doesn't even have a written constitution. That's how dynamic and how minimalist New Zealand is. Why would you have it in writing in the first place? And then get stuck with something like Section 44. But the idea is, in that country, in New Zealand, they decided to give Maori seats in their parliament. The question was, is that a normative signal for, say, Queensland? Should Queensland give the indigenous First Nations of Queensland similar representation in the Queensland Parliament? So that's what we mean here by prescriptive assessments. Of course, why would that be relevant, to start with? Why would you want to do something like New Zealand? And then you can talk to someone like Winston Peters, who's the leader of the New Zealand First Party, and who, of course, now is part of the coalition government, as far as I last remember, with the Labour Party. Okay, and what he wants to do with that? He wants to really scrap all of that, thinking that there's no need for that anymore, because Maori are more or less well integrated already with the New Zealand society. All right. Let's look at the purposes of comparative constitutional law. So the first one is to find the fond commun législative. Okay? So this is from Captain Lambert. And basically that means that you are looking for basic or first principles. So think of something like what you learned about in torts. So this is really doctrinal. Yeah, we're talking about really crossbreeding between comparison and doctrinal analysis. So you look at something like the Lord Atkins, for example, judgment in Donoghue and Stevenson from torts, and you saw that he was looking actually by looking at all of those different cases to see what are the first principles that I can sort of extract and build upon a new theory such as negligence. That's exactly the same thing we're doing here. The fond commun législative. Okay? What's the common denominator? Okay? When I look at two different, or not two now, so you have to look at more, of course, and then you'd look at such as the Ginsburg project, and you'd say, what's the common denominator of all of these constitutions there? How are they all trying to achieve one certain function? Is there a common denominator? Okay. So that's what we mean really by distilling universal constitutional principles. Not just by comparing in that sense, but also through empirical uniformity to an ideal. So that's pretty much in the tradition of Aristotle. So the idea that you're gonna get two or more constitutions and compare them always to this model or ideal. Okay. But of course, we need to remember in that sense what Montesquieu wanted to remind us of, the idea of contextualism. With all that comes with it, so you can't actually have universals. There are only relativities, okay, just like when we talk about ethical standards, for example, right? And remember that subsidiarity has an ethical component, right? And then the critical theorists that you are aware of, including the Marxists and the feminists and all of that. So this is what we mean by the purposes. So you are actually criticizing what's in existence, the status quo, based on those theories. Now, I don't want to keep going on with all of this, okay, because this is almost 70 plus slides. But what I want to do is to finish off soon, or to finish off almost now, with one last slide, please. And that slide I will give to you in terms of something that you could use for your assessments, especially the first one. But remember that it might actually be, you will have to do some more sort of digging or research to find where that stuff came from. Okay, I don't want to close the Zoom, so I will just continue with where we are. I think Julie has left us already. So we'll just say a few things in relation to subsidiarity and its dimensions. So let's just say that subsidiarity, okay, no. We're trying to simply get the pen to work. And I'm not sure why this is not giving me any other options. So let me then use what I have in terms of annotating using Zoom. So I will just go back to my last slide. Okay, it doesn't want to give me other options. Let me just get out of that, and maybe I can just use the annotations from Zoom. Okay, let's just say something like this. So subsidiarity, I will just refer to as subsidiarity, has three sub-principles. Okay? The first one is what we call principle of assistance. I will put them down first and then I'll explain them. 2, the principle of non-interference. And the last one is the principle of ambulation, or what we call helping others help themselves. Okay. So what do I mean by these, and why these are important when you try to answer your assessment? Let's see if we can put them down here, and yes, and we'll leave it there. The principle of assistance. So what it says basically is that if I have a federal government and I have a state government like Queensland, then under subsidiarity, if the Queensland government needs assistance, then the federal government has to step in and assist the state government. So God forbid, if there's an earthquake or whatever natural disaster, then the federal government needs to enter and help the state government. Yes? Now, this really relates to this idea of incompetency. Okay? So if the state doesn't have the skills or the abilities to handle a certain type of decision, the decision making on a certain or in a certain area, then it's incumbent on the federal government to walk in, step in, and help with that area. We've seen this before. The second principle is one of non-interference. Okay? I don't know how to probably enter again. Let's try it again here. No. Okay, there's a typo there, but we'll leave it. We'll leave it. Okay. All right. Non-interference. What does that mean? It means that if the state is competent, then the federal government will not interfere or take away from them the power to legislate in a certain area. So if Victoria is competent on legislating on euthanasia, then the federal government would let them do so. And here is the last point, the point I made earlier to Chris about this possibility of critiquing the issue of incompetence as a argument to use as to whether you want to have the decision at the state or a federal level. And this is the idea of ambulation or dynamism. Okay? So helping others help themselves. So if the state is incompetent, that cannot be a static state of affairs. So we're not going to say, hey, hooray, you know, the state is incompetent, let's make sure they stay competent forever. There's an ambulation under subsidiarity that says that you then need to help the state become competent. That doesn't mean, of course, that subsidiarity necessarily wants to have every and each decision devolved down to the local level. Okay? It simply says that there would have to be this idea that there's continuous improvement. Transfer of knowledge to the subnational level so that they can help themselves. So think of it as raising a child. Okay? So the federal government is the mama bear, okay? And the state government is the baby bear. Okay? And the mama bear will have to take care of the state government, of course, when they are an infant, to feed them and, you know, to take care of all their needs because they are still infants. But the idea is not that the mama bear is going to continue doing that to the baby bear to the point that, you know, they become, what's the word? You know, retarded. The idea is that you are going to help them until the point they are able to take more and more responsibilities on their own. Okay? Just like you help your son or daughter, for example, with their first driver's license, or you would help them to learn how to tie their shoes. You know, the idea is not that you're going to keep doing that for them, for them forever. The idea is that you are telling them, or sort of, you know, transferring more and more skills and knowledge, rather than necessarily powers. But then those skills and knowledge can then be the basis or the springboard from where you can transfer more and more powers. Okay? Now, I haven't given you any references to any of that. You can reference the seminar if you want as the basis for using these, or you might not even use them. I don't mind. Okay, so it's almost 4 o'clock. So we've been doing something like 3 hours. I think that's enough for now. And as I said, if you want more, we can have one-on-one discussions in terms of Zoom or Skype, or just pick up the phone, especially if something urgent. But other than that, I don't think that I want to keep going anymore in relation to the recording. So I'm going to now stop the sharing, and I think we have already okay, so she said she has to go at 12:30 a.m. in the US, so she's in the US, so this is very difficult for her, of course. Yes, so we'll say something that's, yes, Julia. Noted, and thanks. So she was able to make the effort to come and have the Zoom session with us, even though it's 12 a.m. in the US. I don't think she wanted to sit there for 3 hours until, sunrise. So thank you for that effort, Julia. I really appreciate it. Thank you for Chris for coming. Don't feel obliged to come the next time around. I do understand. If no one shows up, by the way, that's fine. I can just go to my office and record from my office, which would be a much shorter recording, so sweeter. And also you will have a lot of background because I have the diffuser right in front of my head. So my students were telling me, no, you can't do that. You have to go somewhere else. You have to go to the TV studio and record there. Yeah, right. So I'll just do the recording in my office, and you'll have to deal with the AC diffuser on top of my head. Okay, so I'll leave it there then. I'll stop the Zoom now, and we are gonna stop our recording at this particular moment in time, 2 hours and 30 minutes. And thank you. And again, if you need anything, just make sure that you contact me by any means. I should be able to reply.